All right, you're on.
All right, hey everybody, it's Michael from Pigeon Hill Brewing Company. Thanks for joining us, or me. Well, no, it's us, because we have Jackie Huss from the museum who helped set this up and make this possible. Thank you, Jackie.
You're welcome.
And Amy, the always amazing Amy, is my camera operator today. So thanks for joining us. We're at the Lakeshore Museum Center in an exhibit that is very near and dear to my heart. This is Cheers, a history of brewing in Muskegon. I was lucky enough to be able to contribute some of the items that are here today, and I'll talk about each of those as we see them, or at least the ones I remember. I also want to thank Aaron Mace. He really took this project under his wing and made it a reality. Learned a lot more than I know. So if you see me referring to my notes here, Aaron actually gave me his talking points from the last tour that he and I did. So I apologize for having to read some of this, but unfortunately Aaron's smarter than me and I just have to pretend to be as good as him today. So if you have questions as we go, please feel free to ask. If I don't know the answer, I might make up a good one, so don't rely on it in a trivia competition, but I'll do what I can. So we start over here, the growth of brewing. Brewing actually started in the Muskegon area around 1859 with a gentleman named J.V. Fassett. There was another brewer, Alfred White, in 1861, Frank Scott in 1862, and we had several other breweries until Neumeister was listed as a brewer, Frederick Neumeister. He was listed as a brewer in the 1860 census, built a brewery in 1866. When Neumeister passed away, his brewery was purchased by a couple of gentlemen, the Muskie brothers, Otto and Gustav, and Ninneman, whose first name is escaping me at the moment. They're pictured here. Kind of a fun connection. The Muskie brothers also had a brother, Charles, who they worked with for a time. Charles ended up going to the Upper Peninsula and started Upper Peninsula Brewing Company in Marquette, Michigan. That building still stands. It's right near our friends from Black Rocks. So if you have a chance to visit Black Rocks, see if you can find the building. Next to our friendly brewers here, we've got a couple of crates. Two of these are actually mine. These are what was used to carry beer. At the time, beer bottles were reusable, and the crates were as well, unlike a lot of the packaging that we have today. And these are especially fun because they're tangible items that remind you of the history, and you can just think about everything that went in these crates, all the beer that flowed through and went in them, and all of the hands they touched, although we're not touching hands these days, and all of the, experiences that these crates had. And they were actually kind of how I got my start in collecting Muskegon brewing items. A crate almost identical to this one is pictured in my kindergarten graduation photo. I actually was standing on top of that crate for the photo. And the crate that I was standing on is now at Lakeshore Tavern over in Lakeside, owned by my Aunt Ann. My family's been in the alcohol industry for roughly 400 years, we're guessing. And so my passion for beer and brewing and alcohol, you could say it runs in my blood. That really tied into my love of history, and connecting with those crates led me to start collecting. So a lot of these items in the collection came about through that love. My grandmother was actually also a neighbor to the Muskie family, who we'll talk about quite a bit more throughout the tour. And so some of my items have a direct connection to them, like my jade plant in my kitchen right now. So that's really where my personal connection starts. A lot of my crates and my bottles came from garage sales, flea markets, antique malls, and eventually folks found out that I was a nut and I collected all these old things, and so they started contacting me. So I'm really excited to be able to show off a lot of these items to all of you. When we're talking about the brewery, here it is during its earliest days. We see a trolley rolling by, horse-drawn trolley. You see the original fermentation cellars, just a very, very small operation. And then we come over to this, which is one of the prized items in my collection. This is a beer barrel. A brewer's barrel is 31 gallons. That was actually defined by law in the U.S. around 1861 or 62 when we passed an Internal Revenue Act, and the federal government decided to start taxing beer. They defined it as 31 gallons is a barrel. Leave it to the government. But this is an old wooden keg, and this is what a lot of draft beer, all draft beer, would have come from back before we really modernized brewing techniques. So the beer would have actually been carbonated in this keg. It would have been put in there flat. They would have added a little bit of sugar, and that sugar would have then caused a secondary fermentation in the barrel, causing pressure. And once the beer had carbonated inside the barrel, it would be shipped out on horse-drawn carts. And when it was ready to be served, the bung would have been knocked into the bung hole with a bung hammer, lots of fun words to say, and the beer would have been served. So that's all I have to say about that. These are some really fun items. These are original tin tackers from Muskegon Brewing Company. And we still use tin tackers to this day as a way of advertising and selling beer. These tin tackers are fun for a couple of reasons. One, they're from Muskegon. Two, they actually came from a house just down the street from here, a house that was owned by Terry McAllister. It was a beautiful old home, and when they were redoing the roof, they found these nailed to the roof. I guess they were used as flashing or to plug up a hole, and so you can see they've got holes in them, and yet they withstood the test of time. And you can see they're advertising a couple of different beer styles. We've got the XX Porter, the Wiener beer, and lager. Wiener beer is actually one of my personal favorite styles, not just because of the name, although that does help. Wiener beer is a dark or amber lager that was one of the most popular and common styles prior to Prohibition. We actually have brewed one several times at Pigeon Hill. It's called Mikey's Little Wiener, so if you ever get a chance to try Mikey's Little Wiener, I highly recommend it. Moving over, we have kind of the progression of Muskegon Brewing Company over time. So we have the original facility right down here in 1877, and as time passes, let's see if I can set down my notes here and do this properly. You see the brewery starts to grow. And now we've got a full-fledged brewing operation. Over here we have lumber, but this whole block has started to become Muskegon Brewing Company. We have keg storage over here. We have a large brewing operation over here, bottling. And oh, this is actually fun. So this is storage of bar fixtures, because prior to Prohibition, breweries were allowed to supply a lot of things that were no longer allowed to supply. And they would frequently do so essentially on loan. So if a bar folded, they would take them back and use them for the next bar. Now we see the brewery in its glory. And here it has taken up most of the block with bottling running this whole section here. We've got shipping out of the back. And by this time, the brewery is, it's really the cornerstone of that area, Brewery Hill, as we call it here in Muskegon. Here we've got a nice photo of the brewery itself. This is the original office. They were able to date this photo based on the fact that this is, well, not the original, but the early office. The newer office was over here. And this is the brew house that was built in 1884. It was a gravity feed system. So essentially they utilized gravity rather than pumps to bring beer throughout the brewing process. Then we have our fermentation cellars over here. Parts of these do still stand. In fact, if you have a photo of Cole's Bakery, you can actually look and see, while this structure was damaged in a fire, we'll talk about in a few minutes, they rebuilt it. And so you can see at Cole's, the roof line goes just like this. And that's because under that sheet metal, part of this structure and much of these structures does still stand. So where we get frozen garlic bread, in fact, the inventor of frozen garlic bread stands right on this site and does utilize some of the buildings originally made for keeping Muskegon in stock with beer. Also a fun note, wooden roads. My, how times have changed. So I have to refer to my notes now, bear with me. I get ahead of myself. Ingredients, the ingredients that are normally setting out have been moved, but I wanted to mention a couple of things about beer and brewing and ingredients. The primary ingredients that we use, the ones that are referred to in the German purity law, actually originally there were 3, now there are 4. There's water, barley, and hops. That's because the Germans didn't understand yeast or how it worked. but now we have 4 primary ingredients, including yeast. And one of the reasons that we're able to make such good beer here in Muskegon is the fact that we have the best water. And I think that's a large contributing factor into why Muskegon breweries were so successful over the years. Even today, we have our water tested, but we have to make very few changes. Beyond the water and the other core ingredients, there are a lot of adjuncts that are added these days, which has allowed us to get this broad variety of styles. So adjuncts are essentially anything other than those 4 primary ingredients. It can be anything from rice to, in the case of our oatmeal cream pie, marshmallow fluff, or fruits. There are a whole host of adjuncts that we can add, and they help continue to broaden and diversify this map of beer styles. Originally, we had lagers and we had ales. Actually, originally we had wild ales where the yeast just was captured from the environment and nobody really understood how it worked. And then as we started to hone the skill, lagers came to be, and each of these spread into their own styles, where we had stouts, we had pale ales, we had lambics, Belgian ales, German ales, multiple types of lagers. And now as brewers continue to be more creative and to push the limits of what is beer, this map continues to explode with new styles being created every single day. You think of India Pale Ales, today there are probably 8 different types of India Pale Ales. There are probably 80 different types depending on who you ask. And even with stouts, we keep pushing the boundaries on what can a stout be? What can beer be? So, as far as the brewing process, there is a nice guide here to the brewing process, but I'm not going to walk through it today because we had a Facebook Live tour of our production facility yesterday, and our brewer Ryan did a much better job of explaining it than I can. As he said during that video, I'm just one of the office boys, so I'm not going to try and one-up him today. Back here, we've got the saloon. This is a collection from items from my personal collection, the museum's collection, and also the Muskegon Heritage Museum's collection. Both museums, wonderful, wonderful places. Let me take a look at my notes here so I don't miss anything. This has everything from the postcards that would be sent out, because in the early days, we didn't have a great method for ordering. We didn't have the internet. So they would send postcards reminding them that a salesperson would be calling, asking them to place their order by mail, or reminding them to ship their kegs back. We've got different coasters over there. Over here we have everything from bottle crowns to the ceramic toppers, old swing tops that would have been used to seal early bottles. And I actually skipped over this in my notes, I apologize. Here we have a map. I'll bring it closer, bear with me. We have a map of the various locations that were owned and operated by Muskegon Brewing Company. Prior to Prohibition, it was actually fairly interesting because breweries could own their own saloons, essentially, which is part of the reason Prohibition came about. Breweries owned all of the retail operations. But prior to Prohibition, that was common, and so Muskegon Brewing started with one saloon, added saloons in Bluffton, Muskegon, started spreading out, actually had essentially a large beer garden and amusement facility, dance hall on Mona Lake, which unfortunately didn't last long due to a fire, and then stretched out. I believe we had one in Greenville. See, I've lost my place in my notes, but we'll find it, don't you worry. This is what happens. 6 properties in downtown Muskegon, and eventually owned 14 properties in Muskegon County. Also had agents in Owasso, Greenville. They had 2 locations in Kent County. So as you can imagine, they were a very, very large operation. In fact, they were one of the largest breweries in Michigan at the time. So back here, bottles. Much like the crates, I love these bottles because unlike what we sell today, they were reusable. And so they saw so many things. They were touched by so many people, which today is a bad thing again. These bottles had experiences and there are stories behind them, which is so fascinating. Most hand-blown, so they have their own defects and their own imperfections. You see the variety of styles, kind of the progression of beer bottles over time. We've got everything from the small to the large. This tray here is one of my favorite Muskegon Brewing artifacts available. There are several that are still out there. This, I believe, belonged to the Muskegon Heritage Museum. We also have one at Pigeon Hill hanging up for everyone to see. This is not actually what the brewery looked like. It's an idealized version. This is what the Meske brothers saw in their heads when they dreamed of what their brewery was or could be. But it does still represent, the front, the fermentation cellars, and Brewery Hill, although I doubt it was ever quite that beautiful. Next to that, we have nickel beer glasses. I wish we still had nickel beer. These were supplied for folks to just grab a nickel's worth of beer. We've got a Muskegon Brewing vest, and we also have one that I'm sure you won't be able to see, but it has a nice engraving of the brewery. Again, that really idealized version. Lots of bottles with labels. And then coming down here, we see a couple of Goebel items and some Guinness items, which we'll talk about a little bit more once we turn the corner. Here we've got a nice shot. We kind of passed by this period of time, but a nice shot of a horse-drawn cart delivering those barrels of beer, those kegs of beer. And my favorite thing about this one, the beer that makes Muskegon famous. Next up, we've got the Meske family. The Meske family no longer resides locally. They're spread out across the United States, but they have a wonderful collection of items from their family's history. And they've been wonderful to me in talking about their family's history and provided several items that relate to the history of the brewery and their family for the museum. So we even have an original stock certificate. We have the passport. I actually can't recall whose passport that is, so it might have been Otto's. And then we've got an original check from Muskegon Brewing Company. Over here we've got the Meskes working in their office. So on the left we have Paul, who is the son of Gustav, hanging out in the office with Roy Alexander, who is the bookkeeper. And over here we've got Gustav Meske hanging out in his office. I would like to note that he has a sailboat on his shelf. I also have a sailboat on my shelf. I just realized that right now. It's a coincidence, but maybe great minds think alike, or maybe I'm not a great mind. Below that, we have a safe that belonged to a gentleman named Albert Gerst. And this is actually one of the original safes from a place called the Antelope Room, which was a saloon owned by Muskegon Brewing Company. Albert Gerst was also the manager. He was the manager of that and also operated the Muskegon Bottling Works. Now, as Muskegon Brewing Company kept growing and becoming more and more successful, there were signs of trouble starting. But before I get ahead of myself, there's one last thing I have to point out. This is the Secret Family Recipe Book. That is a journal that was kept by Fritz Meske. It details the ingredients they used, the methods they used, includes some recipes. I've actually got a printout from it here. Unfortunately, there's not a whole lot that we're able to really take away from it for our own use. The methods have changed so much, ingredients have changed so much, that it's really just not possible to replicate those in their entirety, although someday perhaps we'll have a chance to at least get close. As I was mentioning, times changing, largely in part due to concerns about alcohol consumption and largely due to concerns about the power that brewers had under the system that existed prior to Prohibition. A real push for Prohibition began. There were a lot of concerns about the impact of alcohol and the fact that breweries owned and operated all of their own saloons, so they basically controlled all of it. As a result, Prohibition came into effect in the United States. And in 1918, Muskegon Brewing Company became the Muskegon Bottling and Beverage Company. They were no longer allowed to produce beer, and so they started looking, as every other brewer did, for alternatives, ways to continue making money, to keep their operations going, and frankly, to stay afloat. Muskegon did a couple of different things.
Kurt asked a question.
Oh, let's hear it.
How much did you personally donate to the exhibit?
Let's see, we've got the barrel that we saw early on is mine. 2 of those crates are mine. A number of the bottles are mine. Bottle caps. We've got Muskegon Bottling Company crate. We're about to see a few other items. So I would say some, but certainly not the most important parts. You know, it was definitely a group effort. And I will tell you, my wife is probably very happy to have me donating as much as I have, because it means it's not in the house. So Muskegon Bottling Works made a number of different products, including Orange Crush, so essentially sodas. They started producing completely non-alcoholic beverages. They've got an advertisement for Orange Crush and a variety of other soft drinks that were produced. They also produced malt extract. While they were no longer allowed to create beer, they could produce malt extract. And they could sell that malt extract with a variety of other things, including sugar and yeast and bottles and bottle caps, with explicit instructions on the cans of extract of what not to do to ensure that you did not create beer. So effectively, they were legally selling all of the products people needed to homebrew, and making very clear that people should not follow the instructions on the can lest they create beer. In addition to that, Muskegon Brewing Company did create non-alcoholic products. Besto was one of their near beers. They also had a Bock and another near beer, all of which were less than 0.5% alcohol and therefore allowed under the Prohibition Act. Those beers were popular. However, there was still a demand for the real deal. People in Muskegon certainly operated blind pigs. We had at least two, but probably several more downtown. There are rumors, which I will say were unsubstantiated and can never be proven, that Muskegon Brewing Company was a large part of keeping Chicago wet during Prohibition. The Purple Gang out of Detroit was known, or was said to have some connections here. Chicago mobsters were said to have some connections here, including on Mona Lake. And there was a basement below Muskegon Brewing Company that actually, allegedly has the beer products. Because in order to make near beer, they were brewing beer and then removing alcohol. So you take one step out of the process, hide the product, ship it to Chicago, everybody's happy. I'm not saying that happened, but I've heard stories. I'll just leave it there. One thing that I want to note before we move on, the Besto label here reminds me of a Ken Burns documentary. Allegedly, this exact label was used in that documentary. It's Ken Burns' Prohibition. So if you're interested in history and alcohol history and Prohibition, you might have some time on your hands the next few weeks. Great documentary, and I highly recommend it. Also a reference to Muskegon in the documentary, which is pretty cool. So after Prohibition, everybody got excited. They'd all been drinking. In fact, alcohol consumption went up during Prohibition, oddly enough. But they hadn't been doing it in public as much as they would like. And so Prohibition is lifted in 1933. We're allowed to make 3.2% or less beer. Muskegon Brewing Company gets ready to go. They are ready to begin operating. They actually got approval to do so. And then tragedy strikes, as the plaque in front of you says. On May 25th of 1933, a fire broke out at the facility and caused over $100,000 in damage, which would be over $1.9 million today. So we've got the brewery prior to the fire. You can see here's our actual brewery, our fermentation. We've got new bottling going in. And there we go to after the fire. And all of this has been destroyed. Part of the fermentation cellars do remain, however, they're essentially unusable in their current condition. So the facility was non-operational, and this caused the company to bankrupt. One thing before we walk away, I'd like to note, parts of these are still present under that sheet metal at Kohl's. So parts of the original structure are still there. It's very, very cool to see. So the brewery has gone bankrupt. It is folded. And a gentleman named, I gotta look at the name. Sorry, I finally have to look at my notes again. Frank McKay, who I believe was state treasurer. Frank McKay comes in and buys the brewery property and reorganizes under the name Grand Rapids Brewing Company, which is kind of interesting because it's Muskegon, but hey, we're way to judge. So Frank comes in and starts Grand Rapids Brewing Company in Muskegon, rebuilds the facility. One of the items that we assume was created during that time is this. This is a door that separated the brew house from the fermentation cellar. It may have survived the fire, but we assume it did not. This door is extremely heavy because it is oak and cork lined. This was intended to keep the heat from the brew house away from the fermentation cellars, which are meant to be kept colder. And this was salvaged from Cole's Bakery back in 2014 when they graciously allowed us to come in and look for and take some artifacts to make them available for wider public display. It's kind of a neat industrial item, but also just a reminder of how much things have changed. You compare this to a normal or a modern refrigerator door. So with the Grand Rapids Brewing Company, Muskegon Brewing, or brewing in Muskegon, saw a rebirth. And Grand Rapids Brewing started selling products throughout the state of Michigan, all brewed and bottled right here in Muskegon. Unfortunately, that operation did not last as long as we might have hoped. And in 1946, Goebel Brewing came to Muskegon. They bought out Grand Rapids Brewing Company and began brewing here. Goebel Brewing was a Detroit powerhouse. We talk about the old regional breweries. Goebel was amongst the largest of them. Before brands like Anheuser-Busch and Coors became largely internationally owned powerhouses, we had large regional brewers in the United States, and Goebel was one of them. They were an absolute powerhouse, and so they had a facility in Detroit, they bought the facility in Muskegon, eventually opened one in Oakland, all with the intentions of becoming a nationwide brewery. That actually worked fairly well for a while. They were outselling many of their competitors, and then a variety of financial crises struck, a large one of which was their decision to try and enter the quasi-import market by entering a licensing agreement with Guinness. For the first time ever, Guinness was brewed in the United States, and it was brewed here in Muskegon. They brought in Guinness Ale yeast strain and struck a licensing deal and started creating Guinness Bright Ale and Guinness Bright Lager, all of which were bottled right here in Muskegon. The whole facility was changed over to produce these products. They were expecting a smashing success. Unfortunately, they were trying to sell a domestic product at import prices and struggled. They began in 1955. 1966 admitted that their sales had fallen below expectations. And in September of 1957, they stopped production and closed the Muskegon Brewery. And the property sat idle until it was purchased by Kohl's for use in garlic bread. I might have mentioned this earlier, but frozen garlic bread was invented here in Muskegon. So even though I would possibly rather it be beer being brewed over at the old Muskegon Brewing Company, it's nice that at least we're manufacturing garlic bread. And from 1957 until 2013, November of 2013, Muskegon was without a brewery. Luckily for us, the times had started changing. Craft beer had become, I don't want to say popular, but it had become popular again. People were beginning to want local products again. They were beginning to want full flavors again. And our friends at Unruly were the first to open in November of 2013. They opened on Western Avenue, where they still operate. They also have a functional production facility over in Muskegon Heights now as well, and just received their canning line sometime this week. So hopefully the situation in the world changes soon, so we can start seeing Unruly Brewing cans throughout Michigan. Next up, Pigeon Hill, a little near and dear to my heart. We opened in March of 2014. And expanded to our first production facility about 2 years later, and then built our new production facility, finished that up May of last year. And so right now we have a capacity of actually about 6,000 barrels at this point, each barrel being 31 gallons. And hopefully we'll continue to export Muskegon beer throughout Michigan for many years to come. Next up, we've got our friends at Fetch up in Whitehall. Jen and Dan Hain, two amazing people. Also one of my favorite brewery spaces in the world. They took an old bank and the amount of love that they put into their restoration is incredible. Honestly, even if I didn't drink beer and love their beer, I would probably still go there to hang out because the space is incredible. But Dan does a phenomenal job with his beers. Also does a great job with some of his special Thursday releases. One of my favorite beers in the last year or so was one of his Thursday releases. It was a lavender sour. Next up, we had Josh Rake. Josh cut his teeth at a number of breweries throughout Michigan and then came home, which we're always excited to hear. Josh opened in September of last year. He's creating a lot of different beer than we do and than Unruly and Fetch do. What he calls progressive farmhouse ales. Everything from raw beers to sours. And now he's getting really into the juice beers and just a lot of fresh fruit, funky flavors, creating fun styles that really expand the offerings here in Muskegon, which has been great. And not pictured because they weren't open at the time the exhibit was created, North Grove Brewing up in Montague. Just opened a couple of months ago now. I was up there their opening weekend, and all I can say is the beers were phenomenal. Unfortunately, I haven't made it back since, but everything I had was spot on, so well done, guys. And we end with the advertisements. This is actually one of my favorite parts of the exhibit, and I just love seeing the way that they sold beer. It's similar and yet so different. Unfortunately, we're not allowed to talk about how healthy beer is. Nor are we allowed to say that it's good for you and staves off illness, although in these days I wish it did. But this collection was gathered from the Muskegon Chronicle by Aaron and really highlights the change in advertisements over time, as well as just provides something to chuckle about when you read these things that we can no longer say today. And that's pretty much the exhibit. Do we have any other questions, Amy?
No, everyone's just saying thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks for joining us. We'll be doing some more Facebook Lives. We've got one tomorrow. We're having our anniversary party. So we're doing a virtual cheers. I hope you'll join us for that. Tomorrow is our 6th anniversary. Actually, today is 6 years since we picked up our liquor license. So Joel, Chad, and I, assuming we're not quarantined, will be together to hoist a cheers to all of you, and we hope you'll join us for that. We may be doing an exercise video on Sunday. That's to be determined. And we're just going to do everything we can to entertain ourselves, and hopefully you're entertained in the process.
Dylan just asked, who are the 5 greatest rappers in the world?
Ooh. I'm going to go with Eminem, and Notorious B.I.G.
Awesome.
That was a tough one. So yeah, I'm about to sign out, but thank you all for joining us. Stay healthy, stay safe, take care of each other. I think that's the most important thing. We keep saying support local business, and please do. Not just Pigeon Hill, but all local business. But I think even more importantly, just take care of each other. We're all going to get through it. It's going to be a fun couple of weeks, but we'll get there. Take care.